Hi, everyone. I'm Kelly from English Learner Portal. Recently, a school asked if I could give them a little support and help model how I would take a Eureka Math lesson and make it a little bit more accessible or a lot more accessible for our English learners. And of course, the goal being not to change the math lesson, but just to change how accessible it is for our students. So I figured if I am going to do this for one school, I might as well share it with everybody because it could be helpful. So let's take a look. We are looking at a fifth grade Eureka math lesson. It is lesson 17 and the title is Solve Word Problems. We know that that's trouble already, involving fractions with multiplication and division. So the math itself is challenging, and now we're going to do that within a word problem. So what I want to do with you is walk through just step by step. I started reading the lesson and making notes, and then I decided to stop and just do my think aloud on video so that you can follow along. So let's take a look.
Okay, here is our solve word problems lesson. So I asked the teachers for the standard that this lesson was connected to. So this is Massachusetts. Might be different for you, but always, always, always start with the standard. And the standard says solve real world problems involving multiplication of fractions and mixed numbers. And then the second standard, solve real world problems involving division, on. So the reason why I asked for the standard is this. What is the standard asking? Then I know how much I can change in this lesson. Because the standard says solve real world problems, the goal is to be able to work with the word problems. That is the standard. When we are scaffolding and supporting, we do not want to change the standard. So the question came up in this planning process of, could we just pull the math out of the problems and have the student do the math? Yes and no. Yes, you could pull the math out of the problems and have the students do the math to make sure they understand the concept of the calculations and how the math works. Yes. But you still, to meet this standard, have to go back and put it in a context of a word problem because this says real world problems. So how can we support this? Right? We do not want to water it down or change it so it becomes a different standard. So the goals here, students write multiplication and division expressions, create matching word problems, solve a word problem, multiple ways of solving a problem, share and compare, and the features of a word problem. Okay, so that gives me some ideas of where we might get tripped up a little bit. So we will look at that. All right, let's get started in the lesson. Students decide whether a number sentence is true or false. I read through this, true or false, building fluency. Of course, I'm thinking that we've taught the math, so that's not necessarily the concern here. So we display this number sentence. Is this number sentence true or false? So for the beginning of this, what I would think about is just to remind students true or false, right? Maybe put a visual with it of some kind, practice true and false, or make sure that has been included in instruction previously. What I would also start doing right away is to start an anchor chart. I love anchor charts. That's our bank of words and phrases and sentences that we're going to use throughout this lesson as we build. So I would add true or false to our anchor chart, make sure students understand it, provide a visual of some kind, and move on. Quick quick like, right? Write the number sentence by using the correct comparison symbol. All right, I'm going to want to put that term on my anchor chart. Comparison symbols, what are they? Make sure those are on my anchor chart. All right, more on the anchor chart. In this part, students convert gallons to quarts or pints to cups to build fluency of converting. Okay, so we are working with measurements and doing conversions after each prom. All right, so we're putting up a display. 1 gallon equals how many quarts? 1 gallon is equal to how many quarts? So I want to make sure gallon equal quarts. I want all of them on my anchor chart with a visual so that when we get to this problem, or as we're working through this problem, the students have a visual to work with. Now we're doing this out loud. We're doing this as a whole group. You can have some, make sure you put some think time in there, right? Give them a minute to process. Display the completed equation. I want to make sure equation is on my anchor chart so they know what it is that final product is supposed to look like. Write and complete the equation. So this is all your modeling there. Just make sure that vocabulary has some visual support to it, and that I'm hoping this isn't the first time they've seen those words, because I'm guessing this is a little ways into the standard, that we're not starting from scratch. Students explain the connection between a multiplication expression and a division expression. Students are explaining. We need to have some language here to explain. Direct students to independently try to write more than one expression that matches the tape. So here's what we're looking at. We need more than one expression for this tape diagram. The support I'm putting on my anchor chart, I'm making sure they understand this word expression. And if I want them to write more than one, I'm going to explain, for example, something times something. How could you fill that up? Or it might be something divided by something. I'm giving them a little math frame here, math sentence frame. Here, invite students to think, pair, share about how they see both expressions represented on the tape. So once they do this, we need to practice talking about them. So of course, modeling, do a couple models together. And then I'm going to put this up as a sentence frame on my anchor chart. I see blank because the whole tape is blank and it is partitioned into blank equal parts. The unknown is blank, comma, so blank represents that unknown value, right? Use this model to create a sentence frame for them. Put that sentence frame up, read it together, do again a model together, and then they're working with partners to complete more sentences, more explanations using this frame. Okay. All right, have students work with a partner to construct 2 word problems. Now, this is involving more language, of course. The more we can talk about it first, we want that to be a little bit structured. They are going to construct 2 word problems that have the context of $60, right? And dividing $60 into so many equal parts. So we could brainstorm together. And we might talk about with 3 friends, maybe with 2 friends. We might, 60 is a good number. We might say 6 friends. Give a couple different examples. Where might 6 friends go to spend $60? Right. Once you model a couple, again, visually, not just talking, but writing it on the anchor chart or somewhere, showing it as you go, then they should then be able to come up with their own, with a partner, of course. Now, this might be where you want to think about native language support. If they have that conversation in a language other than English, to me, that would be fine. because I want to make sure they understand the concept and how it works. In the end, I'm going to ask them to explain the final product to me in English, but if they need to think it out in another language, I would I would be fine with that. Now, when students are back to working on their own, there's a couple different options here. You have literacy levels that come into play, you have language levels that come into play. So, a couple things come to mind. This might be something that you pull a small group to the side during this part, and you're being the human reader, and you are reading these scenarios to them and having them pull the math. I would not just take the math out to solve it because we talked about the standard. You also could type these out into a Google Doc or something like that and use Google Read Write or some kind of screen reader that would read the problem for them as an accommodation or as a support for this. You definitely need to provide some visuals for that and kind of explain that the person is sewing. I know they don't get all that support when it comes time for an assessment. But it's also a good time to talk about strategies of, even if you don't know what that is, you know they're taking model for students how to say, Miss Baker has 4 somethings, and it takes 1/4 of that something to make blah blah, right? They can figure out, even if they don't know the words, right? You might want to model what you would do if you're like, oh, I don't know what that is. All right, well, Miss Baker has 4 of something, and it takes 1/4 of that to make a pencil pouch. I don't know what a pencil pouch is, but it doesn't really matter. All I know is that Miss Baker's has 4 yards, and it takes 1/4 to make one of these things, whatever it is. All right, you might want to talk through something like that with them to model. What do you do when there are words you don't know in the problem? This talks about representing yards by using cubes. That would be awesome to put a visual to it. Focus on eliciting student thinking as you walk around and circulate. Refer them back, right? Continue to add sentence frames that they need to talk about what they're doing, right? There might be on a sentence strip, you might put your frames on some index cards and have them with you as you walk around. And if a student is struggling, you can put the card down and like, hey, here you go, try this, see if this helps you. Something like that on hand. Okay, when we start talking about sharing an example, this is Eunice Way. This is an example of how a pretend student solved. And it says, what does Eunice show as the known and unknown information in her first tape diagram? Again, frames. Frames and model. Right? How do I want you to frame your answer? The tape diagram shows, and then figure out what you want in here to be in your frame. And the same thing, ahead of time, go through these questions. What might I need frames for in here to help students? Right, same thing with Toby's Way. What do I want them to say about Toby's Way? What questions am I going to ask? And be prepared with your sentence frames. Looking through, I think we hit most of the vocabulary already. We're just going to talk about same and different.
To summarize all of that, because it truly was a think aloud of just going through and thinking about what our students will need. Here are the big ideas. Know the standard you're teaching to and stick with it. If it says solve a word problem, you're going to have to solve a word problem. So try not to change that standard when you are putting in your supports and accommodations and things. Think through the vocabulary ahead. create an anchor chart with the key vocabulary that's going to come up throughout the lesson. You can do this all at the beginning, or you can do this as you go through the lesson, whatever seems to flow better for you. Be prepared with those visual supports. If you have beginning English speakers in the class, you are definitely going to need those. So you know your students best, you know how much of that kind of support they need. This lesson involves a good amount of conversation with students, which I love. So we want to make sure we support that conversation by providing them frames, by doing a good bit of modeling with those frames, providing lots of examples, having them repeat and practice with those frames before we turn them over to work with their partner. When they're working with their partners, you're circulating and reminding them to use a frame. If you have students who don't always need frames, have them ready on a sentence strip or small cards so that when you are walking around talking with them, if they get stuck, you could say, here is a on-demand support, try answering with this, or have them available for the partners to say, if you need a little help, here's some frames for you, try to answer using some of these. There's lots of time in this lesson. Well, probably not time. There's a lot included in this lesson where we have question and answer. Because that modeling and providing the frames and practicing the frames is going to take a little bit more time than what this lesson is planned for. So with that in mind, I would go through these long list of discussion questions that we might need to pare that down a little bit. Right? We may need to analyze each problem a little bit less. Pick the main ideas, the big rocks that are most important that they know how to explain and justify and solve. And you may need to cut out pieces here and there. That's the reality. So think through, if I'm running out of time, which of these questions can I skip? Because either they already can do that, they get it, or it's really hard to support at this language level, or it's a concept they need, but we can come back to it because we have a time issue. If you don't provide that modeling and practicing with frames and discussions as you go, you will spend the entire time in a discussion that they're not following. I mean, those are your choices, and providing those supports would slow it down, but it would make it much more comprehensible. I hope that helps. This is how I think through when I'm handed a scripted lesson. If you have any questions about what I shared, or if something's unclear, feel free to reach out, info@englishlearnerportal.com, and I will try to answer those. But I hope it gave you a little bit of insight, a few things to think about. Have a great day.